Understand it, because what we're doing here is so much more than setting boundaries. We are literally changing generational narratives. We're reclaiming our power, the power that we always had. We're reclaiming it. And that starts with what you can control, which is your own boundaries. You can't control what other people do, but you can control how you teach them to interact with you. Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about setting boundaries today, and specifically not only what is a boundary, but also why it is so difficult for many of us, but in particular women of color, first and second gen, to set boundaries. Because I am a firm believer that it is much easier to shift behavior when you understand where it comes from. And so today we're going to talk about boundaries. So what is a boundary? A boundary is telling other people what you are willing to accept and not accept. And that could be a physical boundary, it can be an emotional boundary, it can be resources, like what you're physically, monetarily, financially able to give, even in terms of your time and energy. But another way to look at boundaries is that it is a separation between where you end and the other person begins. So the way that will show up is like you really understanding that like the other person's behaviors and thoughts and emotions are not your responsibility. The other thing about boundaries as well is that it's much easier to set them with people that you don't feel like you need validation from. And that's the reason why, let's say with parents, it could be especially hard. With romantic partners, it may be especially hard, or in the dating process. But with a friend, with somebody you don't know very well, you tend to be a little bit more okay with that. And the reason is that when you set a boundary, the person can either rise to it and go, okay, I respect that. Or they can say, I'm not down with this. They could ghost you, they could react negatively, and then that triggers something within us. Generally, it's abandonment or rejection, and we don't want to experience that. So usually we're kind of subconsciously gauging what will happen if I set a boundary with this person. Am I okay with whatever the reaction is? So that answer is probably going to look wildly different if you are setting a boundary with your mom versus if you're setting a boundary with, a client, possibly, even though a lot of y'all have trouble with boundaries with clients. We'll talk about that. But it's just because you don't have so much of like your self-worth tied up in that. And that's why we'll have, soft boundaries with some people, a little bit shaky, tough boundaries with other people, and then sometimes we'll just have like non-existent ones. One of the reasons that it's hard in particular, I'd say for, I don't know, say women of color, but I'd say especially first and second gen, is that to set boundaries is that children are often seen, hi June. Yes, June is also doing a great job of this. Proud of you. That children are seen as an extension of their parents. We are not seen as being individual people. American culture looks at their kids generally as individuals. You are not a reflection or you are a reflection, but you tend to be viewed as your own person. Whereas often women that come from, immigrant parents or grandparents, you are a direct reflection of your parents, which subconsciously that plants the seed that like, you can't be your own person. You can't make your own decisions, because how's that going to make your family look? How's that going to reflect on them? And that creates oftentimes what we see in families as enmeshment. It's like everybody's in your business. They're telling you like what you can and can't do. You feel guilty. They're reinforcing that they're ashamed if you do certain things, or you have to justify things to your parents. And so that's definitely one thing. In daughter of immigrant cultures, we are often seen as a direct extension, almost like a limb, your parents' limb, like you are not your own person. So that is one thing. The other is that when we did try to express a boundary, we were often punished. So if you had a parent like reject you or lash out at you or project onto you or gaslight you and be like, I don't know what you're talking about, that never happened. Once we have a negative association with setting a boundary, after that we're like, oh, setting a boundary is not safe. I'm just gonna go ahead and like avoid that pain and that rejection again and not set boundaries with anybody in the future, I'm going to set shaky ones. And often that happens because our own parents did not set boundaries. They also experienced that same, rejection. And so they project that onto us. And hi, Erica. We're actually talking soon. So that's number 2. Number 1, children are seen as an extension of their parents. Number 2, when you set boundaries, you probably got a negative reaction, or you were punished, or you were rejected, or whatever that was. Number 3 is for marginalized people in particular, when we try to set boundaries in the world, work, whatever that is, we are much more likely to experience backlash from that or microaggressions because it's just not as acceptable. I personally experienced this where it's, and many of you in your work as well, you might be getting told that you're aggressive, or you might be talked over, or you might be criticized. So this is also reinforced in society that it is not okay for you to set boundaries, and that, you're being aggressive, or you're being too dramatic, or you're being whatever the case is. So recognizing that is important, because that way you can say, like, it's not my fault. It's not just in my head. Like, this is real. I have not been supported in my life in setting boundaries. So that's number 3. Number 4, many of you might resonate with this, but if you ever set a boundary, let's say with a parent, this is often when it happens, and you say, Mom, I really can't do this like right now. This is just not a good time for me, or I'm not able to do this. And if you've ever had them center themselves, like meaning I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time, and then they center and they go, I can't believe that you would think this about me. That hurts so much. You're ungrateful. I did this. And what that is that they are centering themselves in your reaction. So what you learn is you're responsible for their reaction. And you then minimize like your negative feelings. You're like, if you're angry, if you are hurt, you're like, I'm just gonna minimize that because that's gonna hurt their feelings if I express how I really feel. And generally, if you look back, you may have had a caregiver who centered themselves in your reaction. So you're expressing pain and they're like, I can't believe that you think that about me. That is another reason. Hi, Michael. Yes, and we are, this is the thing, is that a lot of us experienced one or more of these. And honestly, if you experienced even one, it explains why it's difficult for you to set boundaries. The 5th and final that I will talk about, and this isn't a fact, this is just an observation that I have made over the last 16 months or so that I've been working with Daughters of Immigrants on reparenting, is when we dig back into like family history and some of the conversations that were had in the home, stories that they heard from parents and grandparents, is that parents and grandparents were like focused on survival. Getting themselves out of poverty, not having enough, that's literally what drives immigration. So oftentimes the family is migrating because there aren't enough resources where they are, and that's actually what causes that to happen. And so compliance and discipline of children was like a matter of survival because they just did not have the time or the resources to be like, how are you feeling? Let's get to know you as a person. What are you comfortable with? That's okay. Like, they just don't have that. They're in survival mode. And so even just understanding that made sense for them, but that is okay for you to now set boundaries, and that it is necessary. And what you are actually doing is you are showing people how to interact with you. And the thing about boundaries, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the live, is that the beautiful thing and the scary thing about it is that people can either rise to them and say, okay, I hear you, or they can react negatively, or they can fall away. And that might be easier for us to accept for certain relationships than it is for others. And I think that's the scary thing. It often triggers fears of abandonment. And we would rather not set the boundary than risk being abandoned or being rejected or being criticized. But just you being aware of that, and to say that like boundaries are a form of self-love, that boundaries are teaching people how to interact with you. There may be ways in your life right now, there definitely are ways that you can maybe start, and this is where I'm kind of giving like, here's what you can do from here. Can you identify relationships in your life right now where you know you need to set a boundary, and maybe it feels a little easier to do it? So maybe we don't start with a parent, somebody that's in your direct messages and in your DMs, and they're asking you for feedback, and let's say you've given it a few times and now it's gotten to a point where you start to feel resentment. Resentment usually indicates you need to set a boundary. So that's another thing. If you start to feel resentment, typically indicates you need to set a boundary. So can you redirect them? You don't always have to say no. Sometimes you can say, that's a really good question, I can actually help you with that. Best way to do that is, let's book an intensive. Here's what we would do. Use resentment as like a flashlight for where you need to send it, or where you need to set it, and then define the boundary. So I'm no longer going to reply to, Voxer messages after X time. Or if somebody wants, like fast turnaround, responses, I'm going to give myself a day, or I'm going to set that expectation. Or I'm willing to support someone in the DMs for this type of problem, but if it's repeated, then I'm going to redirect them to an offer. Like, just start to define what you're willing to do and not do, and then express that, define it. And then the next time that you have an opportunity to do that, define it. And the reason it's important to start small is because what you're doing is you're showing yourself you can have your own back, and you're showing yourself that it's okay to do that. And you can start to build boundaries in the more deeper relationships in your life that might be a little bit scary. So I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I think, as with anything, applying a cultural lens is just really important for behavior change, for healing, for growth. And in my career, I have had to call upon everything, because in me getting to the places that I was, which was being the only woman of color, being a director of marketing, working for, all white company for the most part, and subconsciously feeling like I had to shrink myself, like it was too much, like my voice was too big, I was too loud, my mannerisms were XYZ, my passion was gonna be, mistaken for aggression, me feeling like I couldn't be assertive, not even knowing how to be assertive, not knowing how to set boundaries. It affected me as a manager, as a people manager, and being able to lead a team. It affected the way that I showed up in my relationships. I had one directional relationships where I was just pouring in. It was the same in everything. And so once I started to take ownership of that and realizing, like, why do so many of the relationships in my life feel one directional? Why does it feel like I'm pouring into things and they're not pouring back? And ultimately it was my relationship with boundaries and being told or modeled that it was not okay, and that I am personally responsible for the happiness of others. And that really changes everything. And that's why when I became a leadership coach and I literally got certified last year, I was shocked. I mean, it was great, but I was also surprised, because so much of the coaching was just based on like, okay, look at the behavior you don't like and change it. And so we were practicing coaching, and I was just like, well, how can I help somebody change something if we don't understand where it comes from? But when I've worked with people from non-marginalized backgrounds, they don't necessarily have these same struggles to this same extent. And so I knew, if I'm going to be a leadership coach and a life coach for people from marginalized backgrounds, for women and femmes of color, you have to add this lens. Otherwise, it's like gaslighting. Otherwise, it's like painting over mold, like I was talking about in my stories. Understand it, because what we're doing here is so much more than setting boundaries. We are literally changing generational narratives. We're reclaiming our power, the power that we always had. We're reclaiming it. And that starts with what you can control, which is your own boundaries. You can't control what other people do, but you can control how you teach them to interact with you. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. I would love to hear from you. If you are needing support in this area, if you have been looking for either a life coach or a leadership coach, if you have a team and you know that these issues have been magnified, if you heard a little piece of yourself in anything that I shared today, I'd love to hear from you. I have been there. And it honestly, leading a team has been it was such a mirror, and it was an opportunity to practice. So I would say, look at the relationships in your life, whether it's the relationship with your team, the relationship with your clients, the relationship with your partner, parents, as an opportunity to practice you reclaiming your power and stepping into it. So love you guys. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you have a beautiful day.